By the way, I structured this presentation to make it digestible and palatable for you. These are the top 10 things that you need to know about the Craig family in order to tell the story. All right, from Scotland to Mississippi and beyond. So hang on to your hats. Here we go. Top 10 things that you need to know about the Craig family. Starting with ancient history, number 1. Now, I'm going to really dumb this down because it's really crazy. So here's all you need to know about ancient history. And we learned this from genetic genealogy, DNA testing on the Y chromosome, which is passed directly from father to son. Women don't inherit anything from the Y chromosome. So the Y DNA follows the surname. Craig men pass on the same genetic signature to their sons. So as you look for your genetic signature as a man in the Craig family, you need to know this number, IM223. That's a genetic mutation that took place about 4,000 years ago. So it's like your 1,000th great-grandfather that had this genetic mutation and passed it on to you. So if you're in our Craig family, your genetic signature is IM223. Now, what they think at this point, because genetic genealogy is a burgeoning science, it's relatively recent, the way they understand this migration route of the men who had IM223 is they came out of the Middle East. You can see I starts all the way down here in Israel, and it migrated up into Europe. So the I mutation is one of the earliest mutations to come into Europe. And our branch, IM223, made its way into Germany in this area about 400 to 800 AD. So this is getting way back there, right? So we moved from 4,000 to 400 AD. We're in Germany, Germanic tribes at that time. From there, it's thought that the Danish Vikings spread IM223 all across Europe. So you probably have Viking heritage from the Danes. So you can see IM223 comes into this area up here. Now, the Vikings would have spread it right over to Scotland. So the Scots, well, our heritage probably goes back 1300, maybe earlier, maybe a little later. We don't know for sure at this point. But this is the first of many pictures you'll hear me to test your Y DNA, men. Even if you're not a Craig, your family needs you to test your Y DNA. So make sure that you look into that. So number 1, ancient history from the Middle East to Germany, to the Vikings, to Scotland, to you. All right? Number 1. Number 2, Craig arrival in the colonies. This document here is the earliest document that I've been able to track down. Maybe you've tracked down something earlier, but this is from May 31st, 1750. And this is a document from the St. Andrew Society of Philadelphia. So James Craig and his wife, Janet, show up in the colonies in 1750, maybe a little bit earlier. They show up in Philadelphia, and the St. Andrew Society of Philadelphia was an organization put together by Scots for Scots. So as Scottish immigrants were coming across to the New World, they were on hard times. So this group of Scotsmen put together this organization to assist Scottish immigrants as they came over to the New World. You can see down at the bottom here, it might be a little hard to read with this old-timey handwriting, but in this meeting on May 31st, 1750, Mr. John Inglis nominated Mr. James Craig, who was admitted as a member of the St. Andrew Society. So James Craig was a member of the St. Andrew Society until he died in 1793. He served as the vice president, as the treasurer, and various officer positions in the society. And you'll note, if you look on the back table there, there's a book from 1907 from the Philadelphia St. Andrew Society that has some biographies of James and his son John in the book. So make sure you take a look there. So the St. Andrew Society of Philadelphia, Craig's, as far as we know, as early as 1750, our branch in America. Now, there are some other Craigs related to James that were in Philadelphia at this time. But we haven't been able to determine exactly what the relationship was. So, for example, in the St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, there's a Craig family vault there. James, his wife, their children, their grandchildren, and some of their great-grandchildren are buried in this vault. And it lists some other Craigs that are buried there that are not immediate family. So there's some extended Craig family there that we haven't been able to exactly figure out who they are or how they fit in. So there's more discoveries to do. But 1750 is number 2. Number 1, ancient history IM 223. Number 2, arrival in the colonies in 1750 or prior. Number 3, the Revolutionary War. James Craig played a prominent role in the Revolutionary War. He was commissioned as the Commissioner of Naval Stores during the Revolutionary War. He was initially charged with the duty of providing ship chandlery, so the candles and that kind of requirement for the ships, and the cordage, all the ropes for the ships during the Revolutionary War out of Philadelphia. What happened was apparently he and the others that were assigned this duty were good enough that they got assigned the duty for all the ships out of the Revolutionary War in the Philadelphia area. So they were the Commissioner of Naval Stores, providing stores for the ships as they went out of Philadelphia to interact with the British during the war. Now you'll notice also, if you look at that St. Andrew's biography, James was apparently a privateer. He owned a number of ships which were engaged in harassing British trade. Now what is a privateer? Basically, a privateer is a legal pirate. They were given a letter of marque by the government to go use their civilian vessels to interact with the British merchant vessels and attack them and take the ships, and that was called winning a prize. And apparently James Craig won several prizes during the Revolutionary War as a privateer. So yeah, all the Navy guys in the crowd said amen. Amen. Now, the reason he was assigned the Commissioner of Naval Stores, and if you read the documents of the Revolutionary War, the naval history, his name is scattered throughout those documents. You can look up the volumes online for free. He was a former sea captain, apparently, and I assume that is from his old world. As he came over to the new world, he was a sea captain. And so they trusted his expertise, and he engaged in prisoner exchanges. He engaged in some juries based on his expertise as a sea captain to determine what happened in various engagements during the Revolutionary War. So number 3, James Craig, Commissioner of Naval Stores, armed privateer during the Revolutionary War. Number 4, we'll get to in a second, because I want to stop here and make sure you're tracking as we move through the family tree. So here's James Craig and his wife Janet. Most likely, based on information that we have from Andalusia, which is the Craig country estate in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, Janet's last name is probably Hamilton. I have not been able to confirm that, but that's the information that Andalusia has provided, which is a Scottish name as well, which assumes that they were married in the Old World before they came across to the colonies. James and Janet had four children. John Craig, 2 daughters, Anne Craig and Jane Craig. They died unmarried. And Catherine Craig. Catherine Craig married this guy, Don Francisco Caballero Sarmiento, who was from Portugal and Spain. You can see by his military uniform here, he was a colonel. Hang on to the name Sarmiento. Does anybody here have the name Sarmiento? Your aunt had the name Sarmiento, right? That name was passed down. And actually, if you're in the Green clan, you're from the James Sarmiento Craig clan. That's where this name comes in. So hang on to this name Sarmiento. It's going to pass down through the family all the way to today. So it's been passed down a long way through the family. All right, so where we're going next, John Craig, the oldest Craig child. Here he is. Nice miniature portrait of him. And here is his wife, Margaret Murphy Craig. Now, Murphy is not Margaret's maiden name. She was also a Craig, though they were unrelated, apparently. She comes from Ireland. She comes from Ireland, and he comes from Scotland. They both use the Craig family crest, which you have seen prominently displayed here. John was also in the merchant class and owned many ships and traded all over the world, from the Old World to the New World, down to South America, the Caribbean, all over. He met Margaret in Tobago, on the island of Tobago, just north of South America, where she was living with her uncle on a sugarcane plantation. Highly educated woman, spoke several different languages, and lived there with her uncle Caldwell Craig on this plantation in Tobago. He was visiting the island, met Margaret, fell in love, I guess, got married on the island in 1780, and then he took her back to Philadelphia. Now, if you look at Craig family crest, here's the one that you're familiar with here. It's going to be hard to see for you most likely, but these are wax seals of the Craig family crest on personal letters. These seals go back to 1783. So the Craigs have been using this crest at least as far back as 1783. Now this is important as we consider what a family crest is. The family crest was originally invented by nobility to determine different standards of classes. Then it became used to identify knights on a battlefield. They had a crest that stood above a coat of arms, and most often this was worn on the helmet. Eventually it made its way more into the common person. And in the 18th century, crests kind of began to be used without any real authority. People just began to take crests to themselves, regardless of whether it was officially granted to them by the government. And that practice is still in use today, right? People assign a crest to themselves. But there was one family, a Craig family in Scotland, who was granted a crest for them to use, a coat of arms, by the government. Now, the question that we're trying to determine is our group of Craigs descended from this group of Craigs that actually was granted the crest. We haven't made that connection yet, but the possibility seems to be there as they were using the crest as far back as the late 18th century. So you'll find these wax seals on family letters going back to the 1780s. These letters came from the Historical Society of Philadelphia. There are many boxes of Craig family documents there. So if you're ever up in Philadelphia, stop by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and ask to see them, because it's pretty incredible to read some of the stuff that they have buried there. So number 4, the use of the Craig family crest. All right, ancient history, IM 223. From the Middle East to Germany, the Danish Vikings to Scotland to America. Number 2, into the colonies by 1750. Number 3, the Revolutionary War involvement by James Craig. Number 4, the use of the Craig family crest by various members of the family. Number 5, John Craig and Margaret Craig in 1793, as a response to an enormous yellow fever outbreak that happened in Philadelphia, in which James Craig, our original ancestor, died of yellow fever in 1793. They wanted to find a place out in the country where they could get away from the fevers whenever they broke out. So John Craig in 1795 bought a parcel of land of 100 acres up north of Philadelphia in Bucks County, and there began to build a country estate. Now, if you look on the table in the back where the portraits are, there's a painting of Andalusia. Anybody know where Andalusia is in the world? It's in Spain. That's right. And why did he name it Andalusia? Because he traded with Spain, and apparently he loved that region. So he named his country estate Andalusia. The portrait in the back is from about 1800 and the original building. Now, today, Andalusia has been expanded by subsequent descendants, so it looks much different than that portrait. But you'll see there some people standing on the back balcony looking at the Delaware River. Now, Andalusia is a National Historic Landmark. Here it is today. You can go and visit it on the banks of the Delaware River. And when you go, make sure you tell the executive director, I know Jonathan, he told me to come. And she'll let you come in and see everything. There are Craig family heirlooms. I've sat on a couch that James Craig, John Craig, and his children sat on back in the 1700s. There's all that kind of stuff there that we never knew about until we rediscovered Andalusia. So there are really old Craig family heirlooms in Andalusia where you can go and see. So the way it looks today was built by John Craig's daughter, Jane, we'll see her in a second, who married an important person in history. Here he is, Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle was an eminent financier and banker in the Philadelphia area. He had a huge feud with Andrew Jackson over the National Bank at the time. And Nicholas Biddle, you can find him in history if you don't recognize his name. They inherited Andalusia. So Andalusia came from John to Jane, and then it continued in the Biddle family till this day. So it's still in the Biddle family. And so the Biddles still manage the estate there in Bucks County. Now, John and Margaret had a couple of children. James Craig here, born in 1787. There are two portraits of him on the back table. You'll see this portrait and one other right next to it. It's not labeled, but that's James Craig. They had Jane Margaret Craig, who married Nicholas Biddle, and all the Biddles come through this connection, and then actually a second connection, intermarriage number 2 there. And then they had an infant son, John, who died in infancy. So normally what happened is when an infant died, they renamed the next child John. So here we have John Charles Craig. Now, John Charles Craig is a name that descends all the way to current day. So we have many John Charles Craigs in the family. So let me explain where the name came from real quick. Obviously, John is named after his father. The Charles part comes from Margaret's father. Margaret's father was named Charles Craig. He was from Dublin, Ireland. You can read letters that Charles and Margaret write back and forth to each other in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So that's where the Charles comes from Margaret's father, John Charles Craig, 1802 to 1837. Now, I told you to hang on to the name Sarmiento, right? Here it is again. Jane Josephine Sarmiento. She's the granddaughter of Don Francisco and Catherine Craig from the earlier slide. Everybody tracking that? She's the granddaughter of Don Francisco Caballero Sarmiento and his wife, Catherine Craig. Catherine was John's sister. She is the granddaughter, grandniece of John Craig, who married. So they're actually cousins. So here's the intermarriage here. They're cousins. And that's where we're going next. John Charles Craig and Jane Josephine Sarmiento. We've got two portraits of John in the back there. This is a later portrait in his late 20s. The other one in the back is from his early 20s. And this is Jane Josephine Sarmiento. It's interesting to hear some of the descriptions you can read in the red book in the back. She was considered one of the 3 prettiest ladies in Philadelphia at the time. So interesting description of her back in that book. So take a look at that. Now, what's important about John Charles Craig, number 6 here? Apparently, John Charles and his older brother James were playboys. They just kind of lived the wild life. And he was really into raising racehorses. And one of the things that's most important about John is that this portrait here is by an important artist in early Philadelphia animal portraiture named Edward Troy. John Charles Craig was the first to hire him when he came to the United States, and he began to paint John Charles Craig's racehorses, which he raised in his estate in Germantown, Pennsylvania. Now, if you look in the green book in the back, the big open one, that's all about Edward Troy's paintings. There's an entire chapter devoted to John Charles Craig and his horses there, so make sure you take a look at that book. This is a horse named Trifle, who is one of John Craig's earlier horses. Now, you'll notice this name Shark here. Shark was one of the fastest racehorses in the world at the time, and as Shark reproduced, there was Shark number 2, so to speak. John Charles Craig and Nicholas Biddle, his brother-in-law, went in together and bought Shark for $15,000 at that time, which was the most anyone had ever paid for a racehorse in history at that point. So they bought Shark and raced him among other horses at the time. And you can read regularly, there's sportsman magazines that are published and passed around where people could publish races, challenge others to races, trash talk, and you can go and read all that trash talk in there, and it's a lot of fun. And so John Craig established the Craig Cup in Baltimore, Maryland, on the race course there. And you can read about the Craig Cup in the books back there as well. The grand prize was $500 at the time. Everyone had to put in their money and win the pot on 2 different heats, 1-mile heats. And so we're doing a Craig Cup tomorrow. It's not going to be horse racing, but it's going to be all the clans competing against each other to win the Craig Cup. So make sure you sign up on those sheets back there tonight for the competitions that you want to jump in on. Horse racing, number 6, John Charles Craig. This is John Charles Craig estate named Carlton. Now, he didn't build this estate, he purchased it. And what you'll notice on this estate is that there are 2 wings on the estate. He's the one that built these wings. This portrait is actually from the 20th century. He only owned Carlton for about 4 years because he commissioned the builders to build these wings onto Carlton. And then he and Jane, Josephine, Sarmiento, and their child went over to travel Europe, which the Craigs did a lot. So they went over to travel Europe while this was being built. And while they were in Italy, John Charles Craig died at 37 years old. So he was traveling with his wife and his two children, actually, at the time, and a cousin named Edward Biddle. Okay? Edward was the oldest son of Nicholas Biddle and Jane Craig. All right, so we got Edward Biddle in there. Now here's what happens. John Charles Craig dies in Italy. They bring him back, bury him in the Craig family vault there at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. 2 years later, Jane, Josephine Sarmiento, marries Edward Biddle. All right, so this is the second connection of the Biddles in our family. Jane, Sarmiento, and Edward Biddle marry, and we have more Biddles in the family there as well. They were also closely related. Here's their family. Second cousins, I think. They're second cousins. Not too close. Here's John, here's Jane. Here's John Charles Craig Jr., their oldest child. And then they had an infant son, James Craig, who actually died within a month or two of John. So they died within a month or two of each other. Buried in the Craig family vault there in Philadelphia. And that brings us to John Charles Craig Jr. Now, after his father dies and his brother dies, he is the sole remaining Craig. That's it. Down to one. All right? So we're almost extinct. John Charles Craig then marries Martha Barnes Woodington, who is the daughter of shoemakers across the Delaware River in New Jersey. And interestingly enough, we had a cousin post recently this document to our Craig family page. This is their original marriage certificate from 1854. Later, they have an official ceremony in 1856. So because of those two wedding ceremonies, there's some confusion about when exactly their children were born. As we go through the history, some of them say they were born after the 1854 wedding. Some of them say they were born after the 1856 wedding. So there's some uncertainty about some of our exact birth dates coming up here. So what's important about this branch of the family, John Charles Craig and Martha Barnes Woodington? They are the first to leave Philadelphia and come to Mississippi. They come to Mississippi City. Apparently, John and his oldest son come first in 1872. So the Craigs have been on the coast since 1872. In a book by John Lang about the history of Harrison County, Mississippi, he lists the Craigs as being in Mississippi City prior to 1873. In 1874, Martha Barnes Woodington and the rest of the children arrive, and then in the Times-Picayune, there's a list of passengers that have arrived on a steamship, come from Philadelphia by way of Havana, Cuba, over to New Orleans. They arrive in New Orleans in 1874. So apparently, John came forward to kind of figure out what was going on down here, and then sent for the family later once he had gotten settled. The exact reason to why they came down to Mississippi is not exactly sure. John Charles Craig was a clerk in the Customs Service. So he came down and took a position there down in Mississippi City. Apparently, another branch of the family has said that they had seen documents that one of the Biddles owned the land that they then gave to John Charles Craig to live in down here on the coast. I haven't seen that document, but that's probably in existence. I just haven't seen it. And so the Biddles and the Craigs actually have interaction with New Orleans going back all the way into the 1700s as they traveled down to New Orleans to do business and to go on vacation and that kind of stuff. Now this is a picture of Mississippi City from 1902, so the Craigs have already been in Mississippi City a long time by the time this picture is taken. But 1872, 1874 is when the Craigs arrived here in Mississippi. Now this is the 145th year, or anniversary, since Martha and the kids arrived. 1874 to 2019, 145 years, Craig's down here on the coast. Number 8, here's the Craig Homestead. Apparently this is the house that they built. This house stood, it doesn't stand anymore. What stands there now is Edgewater Mall. So on the land of Edgewater Mall, this is where the Craig Homestead stood, between Beauvoir and DeBees Road. Right between those two branches is where this home stood. Now, the gentleman standing in the front here, this is the subsequent owner. So the Craigs sold it out of the family in the early 20th century. This is William Sherman Fitch, who's the grandson of William Tecumseh Sherman. So he bought it, named it Cote Brilliant, which is a name from Missouri, where he was originally from. Names it Cote Brilliant. And there he owns the property until it's bought by the Edgewater Development Company in the 20s, and then torn down to make way for what we eventually will know as the Edgewater Mall and the developed areas there. So as you drive down the coast, just imagine this being there, and that's where it would have stood, right across from the water. Number 8, the Craig Homestead. Here's number 9, Beauvoir. Now, why do I bring this in here? Beauvoir, this is Sarah Ann Dorsey. She's the one who owned Beauvoir and then bequeathed it to Jefferson Davis. She's the one that built it. She's the one that owned it. As she began to age, in 1878, John Charles Craig Jr. witnesses her will bequeathing it to Jefferson Davis. So his name is on her will as a witness bequeathing Beauvoir to Jefferson Davis. So I hope if you haven't been to Beauvoir that you go and check it out this weekend. It'll give you a glimpse into the Craig Homestead. They're not that different in construction. Beauvoir's a little bit nicer. But you get the point. You'll get a little time travel back if you go into Beauvoir and kind of imagine your ancestors being there. So John Charles Craig witnesses the will of Sarah Ann Dorsey bequeathing Beauvoir to Jefferson Davis, and then he dies a few months later of yellow fever. The same month of the year as his great-great-grandfather James Craig died of yellow fever in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So in 1878, there was a terrible outbreak of yellow fever in the Mississippi and Louisiana area, and John Charles Craig died from that. Now, we don't know where John Charles Craig Jr. is buried. He may be buried in the old Mississippi City Cemetery, which is not far from here, but his grave has been lost to time. Or he was buried in a yellow fever cemetery somewhere, which no longer is marked. Or there's also, in a newspaper article, the mention of a cemetery that was washed out to sea. So maybe he was in that cemetery. We don't know for sure. But the Historical Society of Gulfport is working in tandem with, I believe it's Gulfport High, to identify all the lost graves in old Mississippi City Cemetery. So they're working on that, and you can help them out if you want to. But hopefully they'll find John Charles Craig Jr. and his wife, Martha Barnes Woodington's graves there in the old Mississippi City Cemetery. Number 9, Beauvoir. All right, here we go. Number 10. We'll get to number 10 in a second. John Charles Craig Jr. family. This is important because this brings us to you. These are the children of John and Martha. Their oldest son, John Charles Craig. He should have been the third. Apparently he didn't go by the third, but there's John Charles Craig. This is the Red Crew right here, right? This is the Red Clan. Here's the Charles Hopkinson Craig crew, the Blue Clan. Now, where does the Hopkinson name come from? Charles Hopkinson was named after a relative, Charles Biddle Hopkinson. So that's where his name comes from, who was kind of like a caretaker, for John Charles Craig Jr. when his father died. Charles Biddle Hopkinson. Green Clan, James Sarmiento Craig. You know where the Sarmiento name comes from. They had an infant who died, Edward Biddle Craig. You know where that name comes from. They had a daughter, Catherine Laudner Craig. Another daughter, Zora Cook Craig. And then they had another daughter who died in infancy, Louisa Craig. Now, if you can read this, notice all of the spouses here. Latimer, 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 Latimer. 4 of the Craig children married 4 Latimer children. So we have a lot of connections with Latimers on the coast if you know any Latimers. All right? Now, Catherine married a Latimer, but Zora married Robert Scott. All of these 4 Craigs are buried in the old Mississippi City Cemetery. James Craig's grave is missing, but Charles and John's is there, and Catherine's is there. Zora is buried in Hansborough Cemetery. So she's over there. Now this brings us to number 10. You. All right? You've got to be able to figure out how you connect to all this. So I've tried to build in plenty of opportunity for you to make the connections, right? So some of you see yourselves up there. What we've got around the room and what you've got in your folders is all designed to help you place yourself in this giant tree. You can see the family tree is 23 pages long. So there's a lot of Craigs out there. So how do you fit into the family tree? As you have questions, pull me aside and ask me, how in the world am I related to this person over here? And we'll go to the family tree and we'll figure it out. If you have questions about the family tree, bingo. I just met this guy. I think we're second cousins. Can you help us figure it out? We'll figure it out, and we'll find out what branch of the family you're from. So that by the time you leave this weekend, you're going to be able to go through all 10 of these just like that. You got it. Yeah, I'm a Craig. We've been here since 1874, and here's how I'm related to all these other people on the coast. So make sure you ask all the questions you got this weekend, and we'll get this all figured out.